Okay, very welcome everyone. We are very honored to have Professor Neil O'Connor with us again. He has been very gracious to come back to share with us about his industry-linked research on supply chain management. So today he has a very interesting and contemporary topic for all of us. The title is Sourcing Shift, Managing Supply Chain Risk Across the Region. So let me introduce Professor Neil about his background. He's the Professor of Accounting and Head of Accounting Department at Monash University, Malaysia. Neil has spent 18 years in Hong Kong, where he researched the modernization processes of Chinese firms. So examining issues such as performance measurement, order qualification, and trust. His China 1000 project is the largest ever survey of operational risk issues for foreign buyers and Chinese suppliers. He has published 2 books. His book on operational risk and management control of multinational enterprises in China. His publications have appeared in several international journals. Everyone, please welcome Professor Neil. Professor.
Hi everyone, welcome, and thank you, Andre, for inviting me back. And let's make this interactive. I love lots and lots of questions. I just came off a panel session talking to several hundred supply chain majors in the region just last Thursday, and we had a wonderful time. The questions are so critical. What I want to present with you today is the following, and that is trying to understand more about why companies are moving their supply chains in the region, and to what extent are they moving, where are they moving, which industries are the reasons, and the extent of move out of China, and what lessons can we have for understanding and how to make your job as a procurement manager more efficient, but not just more efficient, but more effective. There is so many pressures on procurement these days. And so we can learn a lot by observing, getting data on what has been happening just in the last 3 years alone. And so for the most part, I'm going to present to you some research I've been doing just started this at the beginning of this year, because I think I was sick and tired of people getting up on a stage, industry conferences, talking about saying that, oh, so-and-so moved out of China for the trade war. And, oh, ABC, they moved from China to Vietnam. So Vietnam must be a good place to go to. And, oh, XYZ, they moved to Mexico. So therefore, Mexico is the place to go to. And I'm thinking, we just don't want to hear about case study A and case study B. I want to know the total population. I want to know just how many did move out of China. Like that was my big curiosity. And for the most part, I can only get data on what has been publicly revealed. And what I share with you today is probably just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe there's so many private companies that have moved capacity out of China. Like, they don't have to mention that. They can keep things secret. So, there's stuff here that I don't know about, but what I'm revealing to you today is what I've got from the internet, which every one of you have access to. And I would encourage Andre to, make it an assignment in the future. I think this type of stuff makes for a very good assignment. Okay, so sourcing shift, managing supply chain risk across the region. Last year, I put together this slide in my thinking about, all right, someone wanted to interview me about, well, what's going on with COVID? And I thought, okay, let me just make a picture. Number one, there's lots of uncertainty for MMCs, for SMEs, for brands, for importers, for the big people, for the small people. And for the most part, for the SMEs, they were likely to change country because they cannot afford to be in many countries. But for the multinationals, it was more likely that they would continue their portfolio approach to managing across many, many countries. And therefore, they wouldn't just move on cost alone. Trade war puts 15%, 20%, 25% on the bill of lading that arrives in the USA. Oh, I'm going to move to another country where I don't have to pay that. Well, for multinationals, that's just one part of, that's one data point that may force a decision to be made, but often the strategic decisions need 2, 3, or 4 factors that come together and then say, okay, we need to make this decision to move. And often multinationals, they want to stay in China. Why? Because, you know, in many industry sectors now, China is the largest consumer market in the world. Like, you know, its total GDP is not the size of the US yet. We probably have to wait until 2028, 2029 that will happen. But in some sectors, China has a larger consumer market than the USA. So there's obvious reasons that multinationals want to stay in China. All right. And so the big message I give to industry players is you don't move for one factor alone. And often multinationals are staying in China to actually consolidate the supplier base, not to have many suppliers, but also to develop the relationships. Well, the pandemic sort of put a stop to that, because now with border closures, it's really hard to develop relationships. And border closures is a physical barrier to you strengthening your relationships with your suppliers. And in the risk conference I spoke to last week, the big thing that you want to take away in this is just like a pre-summary to what I'm talking about today. The big thing you want to take away in part of managing risk, because of border closures, increasingly we are reliant on third-party proxies. We are reliant on experts in the country where our suppliers are, and hopefully they will do the job, the proxy relationship on our behalf. Now, whether that's as effective as you go into that country yourself, that's a discussion for another time. But border closures obviously is making things difficult in terms of managing relationships. All right, so where did these companies move? All right, I tracked that. We've got 99 firms, 135 country moves. So what do we mean by 135? Well, what it means is, so when Hasbro moves out of China, it may move extra capacity to Vietnam, to Mexico, and USA. So therefore, for Hasbro, that's one firm, but then that's 3 country moves. All right. So if you have a look at SC stands for single country, and MC means it's part of a multi-country. So the top 5 is Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, and Mexico. Of course, Vietnam, 39 single firm country moves, but 9 multi-country moves. Vietnam was part of a multi-country move, but also it was a recipient of single country moves. That is, a firm goes to Vietnam, it doesn't go to any other country. Wow. Can we learn more from this? Well, we can learn a lot, and I'm going to break down some of these data to show you some of the patterns that we can learn. If you notice some of the pictures here, some of them have got a car next to them, like South Korea, Japan, Thailand, USA, Mexico, Serbia. Serbia, that was a supplier of components, and they just moved to Serbia. But USA, Mexico, Thailand. Vietnam is not a recipient of capacity moves in the automobile industry. So in the automobile industry, you see India is a recipient. India, Thailand, Japan, and South Korea. All right. What about the second choice? Remember, I asked you, we asked and looked for data on if you move first, which country did you move to? Well, we moved to Vietnam first. What's our second country? Then to Mexico. So what we've got here is data on the second country choice, not the first country. And already Vietnam, Thailand is dominating the second country choice. So if Vietnam isn't your first country, for 9 cases, it was the second country of choice. Okay. What are the companies that are moving? I want to know if you have, I want every one of you, can you just show a thumbs up if you see a company that you know, if you know on this list here. I want everyone, everyone, you must know some company on this list here. Come on, I want to see every thumbs up. Jacob, you too. Thank you. Appreciate that. And thanks for dropping in on today's talk. It's wonderful. All right. As you know, like remember, this is public data here. All right. Obviously, there's a lot of private companies that we don't know about, and they don't have to reveal what they are doing. But this is public data. And so it's okay for me to show you all of these brand names. All right. And amazingly, like Vietnam, a huge recipient of a lot of multinational brands, and you know many of those that are going on here. All right, so this is another way of displaying how Vietnam is dominating the shift out of China. And what we've got here in percentage terms, like nearly 40% of the 99 companies that we have tracked. But it's different when we look at different industries. So if we look at auto, Vietnam doesn't dominate, but Thailand, Japan, Mexico, and USA dominates. If we look at components, Mexico and Japan and Taiwan are dominating. Household, of course, Vietnam and USA, India are dominating. Malaysia, obviously there's two moves there, and it definitely the household and the industrial sector for my student friends that are in Malaysia. And so you can see that it's not horses for courses. It really depends on which industry you are in. Like Cambodia, we'll come back to this later, but it's really interesting that Cambodia is the recipient of all the bicycle manufacturing moves out of Taiwan and China. Amazingly, that Cambodia has its little ecosystem of bicycle manufacturing, mainly for assembly, because if you go dig deeper on bicycle manufacturing, they still source a lot from China and Vietnam and Thailand by components, but it's assembled in Cambodia of all places. And one of the attractions of Cambodia was it still was a trade-free zone in shipping into Europe for many product categories. And so that's what Cambodia had advantage over Vietnam on. All right, so what about North and South Vietnam? Then, so, Jacob, you're in Vietnam, and appreciate you joining us. Like, it's not the same. North Vietnam is not South Vietnam and vice versa. You cannot say that Vietnam is a single country. And what we learn is that those companies that have moved capacity to North Vietnam was more in the electronic, the components, smartphones, whereas those that went to South Vietnam, more of the household, sports and outdoor, and a bit less of electronics. And, we can learn a lot from that difference. Often when you make a strategic move of capacity, you are highly dependent on the ecosystem to where you are moving. You cannot just say, let's just move down to Ho Chi Minh City because the property agents give me a great deal to set up a factory there. Well, hang on. Your assembly factory needs raw materials. Where are you going to get the raw materials from? The electronics and things like that. And so obviously we can see that being up in North Vietnam, you're actually closer to getting parts from southern China. There's obviously benefits from being in North Vietnam that you don't get in South Vietnam and vice versa. So really, really interesting. Jacob, you're there. You any comment on that? Because you are in Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, it is very dependent on the location and what industry it is, because there's a very, very distinct difference between the industries that are going to the north and the south. Right. And there's clusters of different things in different cities. Right. I mean, it's similar to China. China has different regions and different cities where different industries are much stronger than others.
Appreciate it. By the way, just for the audience, Jacob, you're actually got a sourcing business and you're based in Vietnam as we speak, correct?
Yes.
That's great. See, students, it's so important to reach out and don't, just because I'm a professor, it doesn't mean I know everything, and always pull on other people's expertise to help me with the messaging I want to get across. Thank you. Appreciate that you're jumping in here, Jacob. If you answer questions going forward, please, happy to help you entertain your participation. This is the same graph again, and just wanted to show that. What about equivalent people capacity moved out of China? Here we have, if we try and look at capacity, like a firm move, it doesn't mean a one-person capacity. India and USA have actually taken a lot more people capacity than Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. And so that is really telling in itself. The large factories are not necessarily moving to Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, and in particular industries. India, recipient of tens of thousands of capacity, and we tried the best we can to try and calibrate how much capacity was actually moved out of China to these different countries. Okay, so which industries? We can go in a little bit more detail on some of these industries. And so I've talked about, the horses for courses. There are different industries here. The electronics definitely has dominated the move of capacity out of China. When I say, I specifically say movement of capacity, not the movement of factories. Because when we say movement of capacity, it may be that a brand has a major contract manufacturer in China, and instead of expanding capacity with that contract manufacturer, they decide, let's just expand in Vietnam instead. So they're actually moving capacity. They're not actually closing. For the most part, we only counted 15. They're not closing the factory or they're contracting with China. They're just expanding capacity to other countries. And so that's what we mean by moving capacity out of China here. So electronics, auto, household, industrial, component, sports, and outdoor. And now this is really interesting here. What about the location of company headquarters leaving China? We got USA, the Japanese. Now we know with the USA, obviously 36% of these 99, so 36 companies are based in the USA, like their headquarters are US, they're US owned, so to speak. All right, followed by Japanese and Taiwanese. So you can see there's a kind of an allegiance there where US, Japan, and Taiwan are, for the most part, are quite on the same playbook when it comes to geopolitical risk and global sourcing, and not to mention, the current thing that's playing out in the semiconductor industry. But for the most part, the trade war initiated a lot of movements out of China, and the USA owned companies, obviously they're most sensitive to the US policy with the trade war that's going on between USA and China. If we look at the location and industry, you will see that electronics is dominating the USA, Japan, Japanese, and Taiwanese owned companies, followed by a little bit less automobile, then component, and then accessories and souvenirs. Notice that clothing is not a dominant item here. And so it's not that you're moving capacity out of China because of the trade war, because of COVID. But that's a conversation we can have later on, because with the current geopolitical risk associated with Shenzhen cotton, you have issues faced by apparel companies all of a sudden. Like I spoke to the global supply chain manager of Puma, Anne-Laure de Courts, 4.5 years ago. What is your biggest challenge? This is before Trump came in, 5 years ago. They said, our biggest challenge is understanding and getting visibility on our second tier supplier, third tier supplier, and fourth tier supplier. Who would have known that, 5 years later, that geopolitical risk sourcing from Shenzhen would be so sensitive? And it really, there's not much you can do in having alternative sources in China. Remember, Xinjiang region produces 5 million tons of cotton per year. compared to China's total of 6 million tons of cotton produced. India has about 6 million tons and 4 million comes from USA. You can say that if you are sourcing and your cotton is being supplied to you in China, it's very hard for you to convince customs in the USA that it's not from the Xinjiang region. And you could speak to the people at Uniqlo who had customs shipments stopped at the border in USA early last week because they really couldn't, they're guilty until proven innocent. You know, the geopolitical risks are actually, you know, what I'm not showing you here is clothing and apparel so much, but you can see that that's coming out now, and that may spur further sourcing shifts this year and the next. Okay, let's keep moving here, trying to weave in some of the current challenges that are facing supply chains as we go through these graphs. That's another way of depicting the electronics, auto, household dominating here. All right, business type of companies. I tried to think about, okay, some of this capacity move is for B2B. That is, you're making auto components, so it goes to an automobile, or B2C, where you actually make your assembly, you're doing final assembly, and then it's going direct to market. You know, it's put into container, it's shipped to the USA, and then it goes on to Amazon and sold through Amazon. So B2B and B2C is another way that you could actually separate out the reasons for factory moves. For the most part, B2B is a much more strategic and associated with a larger brand names or multinationals, because you just need that where-it-all at that level to actually make a good business, because there's so many, much more pressures in the B2B world. You know, the margins are squeezed in many, many ways, whereas B2C, you can innovate and change products very, very fast, and actually when margins of a product's going down, you can innovate and go into a new product group and then increase your margins again. So, you know, B2B and B2C, they face different risks. And so I want to tease this out further even after today's presentation. Okay, the most important thing, most interesting part of today's presentation are the reasons for moving. And I could ask all of you to put your hands up if you've got reason, what would be a dominant reason for moving? And maybe let's, Andre, can we ask everyone in the chat room, what do you think the dominant reason for the move is? If everyone could just type in something, have a guess. What is the dominant reason for moving capacity out of China?
Let's put on in the chat.
Yeah, just type it into the chat. Let's get everyone to type in something. It's important we get a little bit of participation. Everyone here, we want everyone, just what comes first to mind? Okay, so we've got cost of raw materials, trade war, cost, geopolitical, increasing costs, diversify. Everyone, please, just what comes to mind? We're not after totally reasoned ideas, kowtow to USA. Okay, good. Diversify, quality raw materials, increasing costs, geopolitical. Okay, 5 seconds. If you haven't got something, what's in your mind, just type it in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Not really econ reasons, quality raw materials, lower relative cost, diversify. Okay, so like these are all of these reasons are reasons to strategically move from one country to another. We know that's played out in the footwear area for the last 30 years. You know, cost has been driven the footwear supply chain snake for the last 30, 35 years throughout the region. But there are other reasons, as you mentioned, geopolitical, diversification, there's trade war, there's political. So let's have a look at some of those reasons. We can look at internal drivers. or industry drivers, external environmental. Like there's a framework. This is my only academic slide for today's presentation, so forgive me. And you know, when I write this up, we will start with a framework like this. But for the most part, a lot of the drivers are in the bottom two sections. That is external drivers or environmental drivers have been driving a lot. Internal, of course, minimizing costs, but that has never been a single reason for moving. There's always been one or two or three reasons. Like that could be a hypothesis in some sectors. Is it in some sectors it's just cost? Maybe other sectors it's 1, 2, 3 reasons. There's another question too. All right. So is globalization dead? David, let me hold on to that question and okay, so what I've put 4 groups of reasons: incentives from the moving country, issues from the USA, that means trade war, tariffs, geopolitical risk, the fact that every other weekend there might be an announcement coming out from the president, you know, the White House, Trump administration, Biden administration, Trump, it just happened just about every other month, make an announcement about what they want and what they do not want in terms of whether we want you to source from China or not. You know, these are all issues as much as, number one, the tariff plus the rhetoric that was coming out of the US White House. All right, then issues from China and then internal ability. So there's 4 different groups here. All right, so let's have a look. We went through all of the 99 companies, and this is looking at multiple sources of information, and we spent a lot of time documenting whether a particular reason is the trade war, whether a particular reason is an established factory or cheaper land, labor, tax incentives. All right. So what we find here is that if a company has already an established factory in another country, it was so much easier for them to shift capacity. And you can say, well, Neil, that's a no-brainer. So, you know, what do you tell me here? Well, I'm telling you that, you know, it's not just to escape the trade war. There's, you know, the trade war may be a switch that says, oh, let's move. We already have capacity in another country. Okay, let's take the opportunity to expand the capacity in the other country. Or to do what Nike did, like Nike stopped contracting in China, and then they just expanded their contracting of sourcing from, didn't stop, they actually really reduced it to a very small amount. And then they just expanded all of their contracting that they're doing with their, and just note this, 116 contract manufacturers they have in Vietnam. Like, it's not like Nike goes and builds a new factory in Vietnam. No, Nike just goes to its contract manufacturers in Vietnam and say, well, okay, our orders are going up. And so that's what we mean by, if you have an already established factory or already established contracting arrangement in another country, then it's very easy to make a sourcing shift. And so later on, we'll have a look at those that did have an already established factory, and we're going to show you some interesting data on that. But what else is there? You know, geopolitical risk and increase in tariffs definitely is very, very critical here. So let's have a look at these issues. And so you got your red, incentives from the moving country, issues from USA, issues in China, and issues in internal ability. Notice that if you look at the electronic, then issues, the incentives from the moving to country, it was very, very big. And when we talk about issues and incentives, you know, already established ecosystem is a very, very big issue for electronics. But if we have a look at auto, then, you know, you can see, and the household, it's only, you know, those issues 6%, 5%, and component 5%. But for the electronics, it was 15%. This is our total 311 responses. So we documented over 311, you know, reasons for moving across those 99 companies here. All right, let's have a look at some data. All right, because I'm making a big hullabaloo about already established factory. Well, here's the list of the country moves where the firm already had an established factory. All right. So, and you can see that India, Japan, Mexico, but you see North Vietnam, South Vietnam is quite dominant here. So you can see that countries that move to Vietnam, it's not like Vietnam's a great place to set up a new factory. And I'm sure Jake could comment later that it's not so easy to just go to Vietnam and build a new factory now. It was easier to do this 4 or 5 years ago under the TPP, or 5-6 years ago when Taiwan set up a lot of factories in Vietnam because of the TPP, that is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But then Trump said, oh, we're not going to be part of that. And I think there was kind of egg on the face of these Taiwanese companies that actually built capacity in Vietnam back then. But now, playing the long game, it turned out to be a good move, because now if you want to set up a factory in Vietnam, number one, there may not be property available in the best place. There may not be warehousing space available in the best place for your factory. And also the supply of the ecosystem, the raw materials, may already be booked up to factories that have already expanded capacity in Vietnam. Yes, so very, very interesting what we see there. The extent of moving out of China. All right, the issues from China, obviously it was spread across costs, the fall in China sales, the coronavirus, dependency on China, you got border closures, xenophobic risk, very, very big for the South Korean companies that moved out of China because of what happened in 2018-19 when South Korea put in a missile defense system, built by USA. Obviously, China reacted to that, and at the consumer level, they basically just blacklisted a lot of their Korean brands. And so that's what we mean by xenophobic risk, IP protection, shortage of spare parts. But issues from the USA was, well, we're moving to the USA because we want to escape the tariffs. Hasbro were moving some of their toy production to the USA, but they're also moving it to India, Vietnam, and Mexico as well. Remember, Hasbro, like Nike, they don't have their own factories. They just contract out their toy manufacturing. Again, it's easy to move when you are contracting. Geopolitical risk was the other issue. All right, what about those that move 100% out of China? Why am I showing you this? The reason why I want to show you this is that because the media is always discussing, are people sort of saying no to China? That is actually blacklisting China completely. The answer is no. What do we mean by no? Well, here out of 99, I only count 15 that have actually closed up shop with China. 15 out of 99. And only 10 of them are USA companies. So you can understand the USA companies having that motivation to do that. And Harley Davidson basically never really got a factory set up in China anyway. They had plans to build a factory. They were in the process of going through the agreements and everything. And then they decided, no, we're not going to go ahead with this. So you could say that technically there's only 9 out of 14 US companies. The South Korean Kia Motors, they've totally closed up with China, and a lot of that xenophobic risk. The Japanese companies are encouraged by their own government to move. So you can see that a lot of these moves are driven not by cost, much more by geopolitical risk, xenophobic risk, and their home country, encouraging them to move. Huafu, I need to find out a bit about that, because, it's strange for a Chinese-owned company to actually close its own operations in its own country. But I need to learn a little bit more about that. But they moved to South Vietnam. As you can see, the countries that they moved to are in your top right-hand corner. And you can see that Vietnam, again, the recipient of 12 out of those 15 closures of operations in China, which is amazing. And for the most part, a lot of these, Vietnam is a huge recipient, but for the most part, it's not the first time that these companies have moved to Vietnam. All right, so just finishing this up, and then we'll take some questions. So I'd like to have some interaction here. So I want to look at, we're talking about overall percentage shift out of China. As you can see, there's a lot of 20 to 30%, a lot of 50%. As the best that we could do in actually trying to calculate, the manpower that they have moved from China to another country. And as I just showed you in the previous slide, only 15% have said, okay, no more China, we're moving to another country. All right. And then where have they moved to? If we look at that 100%, they, of course, going to Vietnam, as I showed you, 12 out of those 15 were moving to Vietnam. Mexico, a little bit, Mexico, Thailand, India, and Malaysia, the recipient of 100% shift. But then you can see that Taiwan, Japan, USA, they're a recipient of a partial shift, not 100% shift. All right, and then I tried to graph, is there a difference between the first to 50% or the 50 to 100? And I really haven't, I don't see a difference there. And so just finishing that up, I showed you this earlier, equivalent people moved, India, USA, kind of the largest recipients of capacity. And if that translates into manufacturing value added, then obviously India and USA are large recipients in that way. Industry cases, we can look at individual, and just want to finish up with this and lessons learned. Vietnam, and Jacob, you're welcome to comment when I finish this slide. Electronics, it's always been a challenge because the lack of skilled labor, facilities, the ecosystem. I mentioned a little bit about that, and the bureaucracy. I've actually showed that North and South are different. And as I did explain, Taiwanese were first movers 5 years ago because of the TPP. And it's really difficult to go there now because of the lack of warehouse space, getting access to property in the right areas, unless you're in a particular dedicated industry that you can go into a trade, a special technology park where the Vietnamese government would welcome you, maybe like smartphones. But, if you're in other industries like, kitchenware, apparel, that, you may not be as welcome. Jacob, you could comment on that. Just summarizing on other things, insights that I got, that, apparel and geopolitics, I mentioned about Xinjiang cotton. This is going to be a huge concern for apparel companies who are still sourcing from China and trying to export to USA and to Europe. Obviously, if they're still in China, they're actually there to actually sell in China, China being the largest apparel consumer market now, if not equal to the USA, it is actually larger. Geopolitics is still going to drive that. Bikes in Cambodia, there's a lot of several Taiwanese US-owned bike manufacturers that have moved to Cambodia and to Vietnam. But for the most part, the move to Cambodia is much more assembly. It's not like there's ecosystems there for you to get parts from Cambodia. They're still importing parts from Taiwan, Vietnam, Thailand, China. The bike parts are going to Cambodia, then they're assembled and then shipped to Europe for the tariff advantage, and to USA. Vacuum cleaners, what's interesting, Bissell, one of the largest private-owned vacuum cleaner companies in the world, they're competing. There's 6 big players in the vacuum cleaner industry in the USA. I just want to mention this. Why? Because of the 5 of those 6 top players are actually have their factory assembly in China. Okay, Bissell, Electrolux, Hoover, there's 1 or 2 others. Dyson, who we all know now because they're kind of behaving like Steve Jobs and Apple, and actually setting up shops in brand name high-end shopping districts, just like the iPhone store. Dyson, I separate them out because, interestingly, out of all the vacuum cleaner companies, they are set up in Malaysia and Singapore using Flextronics as their contract manufacturer. And so with everything that's happened with the trade war and geopolitical risk, Dyson is actually the best place to compete in the vacuum cleaning industry worldwide because of where they are located. And you would think, why on earth they would have located there in the first place? Well, this is what it means when we talk about strategic location. You cannot just, the big message I want to give to students with strategic location and procurement is you need to have a very long-term view on where you set up shop, where you contract, where you set up the factory. You cannot just be reactive and say, oh, trade war, tariffs, oh, we need to move factory tomorrow. You cannot do that as a strategic operations procurement team. You cannot do that at the strategic level in companies, even though, the trade war is, the loudest speaker in the boardroom. You cannot just move because of one factor alone. Contract manufacturing, for the most part, is actually allowing companies to be so flexible, like Hasbro, the example, Nike, the example, two different toys and footwear, for example. So let me just finish there. Like, there is the top 10 COVID trends that I have. This is O'Connor. This is what I do. I just love getting data off the internet and trying to make sense of things that are happening in global supply chains. And you're most welcome to check out my YouTube, where I have a lot of video documentation of factories in the region. Let me just stop there. And Jacob, comment on Vietnam, then we'll leave it to the students to ask questions.
Well, I think one of the big one there is Kong is saying about the challenges of electronics manufacturing moving to Vietnam. It's not much of a challenge because, the Foxconn, the J-Balls, all the assembly factories are already here. They can move production very quickly, ramp up very quickly. The only challenge is it's slowing down the process, that China wants to slow down. China wants to slow down the component manufacturer from shifting over and moving to Vietnam. They think they still believe that everyone will accept that the component manufacturer will be done in the Xinjiang area, and it's a 12-hour truck drive to the Haiphong area for the electronics assembly. They believe that they will leave those production facilities in China. It doesn't make much sense, but the difficulties of traveling right now and everything has slowed down that move. So it'll give China probably another year extra in the move of the component manufacturers to Vietnam, so they'll be available locally with the assembly factories locally. But nothing's much going to change. It just slows down some industries.
Right. Thank you, Jacob. Let's have a look at some of the questions we got here, Andre, if we go through them. Would you like to read them out?
Let's read out the questions that's in here. We have quite a lot of questions. Thank you very much.
That's good.
What are the main reasons why companies move to Vietnam?
Well, the number one is the cost as a driver. Number two, the trade war. Okay, the trade war, because you get tariffs and ship out of Vietnam to USA. The cost, trade war, and for the most part, as you noted there, that a lot of companies, Vietnam is just one of many companies. It's not just the only company of moving to Vietnam. Jacob, you add anything on to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a lot of things are moving out, but things are moving out very quietly. It's the same thing that you see with Hong Kong and Singapore. Many, if not most or all companies are setting up a Singapore headquarters, but they're not calling it their Singapore headquarters. They're slowly, no new contracts are being signed in Hong Kong, i.e. China, and they're being signed in Singapore. So that's a major flow that's changing. And it's the same thing that happens in China is they don't want to announce to the Chinese government that we're leaving and shutting down because they will be punished, attacked, whatever. So they are very quiet. Most companies are very quiet about how they're leaving.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
The next one, Andre.
The next one is, are there any strategic reasons, long-term, why certain countries are recipients of FDI?
The longest term strategic reason is, number one, is the business friendly environment and the stability of the government. And not to put a too fine point on it, every country goes through some uncertainty and government, I guess, uncertainty from time to time. And like Malaysia in the last 3 years has had its share of difficulties, and its amount of FDI coming into Malaysia is actually is the lowest in many, many years. And that's a lot of it is because of uncertainty. Vietnam, there's certainty with the government because the government has designated, just like how the Chinese government has done this 20, 30 years ago. They've designated key industries, they've designated certain zones, and they want business to flourish. And so if you ask me if there's one thing that really drives the move, it is actually government encouragement for that industry. And number two, a stable government. Vietnamese government, it's quite bureaucratic. There's lots of documentation and everything, much more bureaucratic than other governments, but it's stable. And so that's a big factor when we talk about FDI in general.
We have the next question from Imtiaz. This is to Jacob. The Southeast China to North Vietnam supply chain is road based or naval?
Naval. I mean, it's based on naval power, but
I think it's about whether it's by shipping or by road.
I mean, it depends on what industry. I mean, with the electronics, and one of the big industries in the north is electronics assembly, and it's trucks going from Guangzhou area to Haiphong area. So that's all by road.
Yeah, that wasn't a war question there from MTS, but I like the naval. I mean, it's shipping there. Okay, so let's have a look at our next question there, Andre. Please do ask questions, everyone. Please.
From Kang Hui Yin. So why is bureaucracy a challenge for the electronic industry to move to Vietnam?
There's lots of documentation. You have to get approval from. Difference between Vietnam and Guangzhou, and Jacob, you can add on to this too. Happy to, Vietnam has 90 different provinces, but it's very much unjoined up. It's not like they're all on the same playbook. And so you've got to be very careful that you get approval with the right council, the right county government, and you go through all the proper levels. Whereas in Guangzhou in China, there's 90 different groups, but they're all under the one page, and there's much more stronger central control over what all of those 90 counties are doing. Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big difference is China's had a lot more time to deal with this. They've had 30, 40 years of Europeans and Americans in China, developing factories, doing business, complaining to the local government what the issues were, and it's slowly being fixed. And Vietnam, is still at the beginning of this process. I mean, I think they've learned some lessons from what's happened in China, but talking with lawyers, talking with FDI people, They haven't changed their laws, and they have kind of an old system that has to be changed a little bit because it's not set up for foreign direct investment, really. So there's a lot of challenges with the bureaucracy that, you know, if you're going into another country, maybe you just have one set of paperwork, but Vietnam, maybe because of the regulations, you have, you know, 50 different paperwork systems with 20 different departments with a bunch of problems. So in China, they've really consolidated that down to usually one department that does it and then submits it to the central government.
Yeah. And now, like, Vietnam now is going to be the second largest exporter of smartphones after China this year. Like, it's just crazy how the whole smartphone, Samsung's moved a lot of its smartphone verticals to Vietnam into a trade park, welcomed by the Vietnamese government, and boom, you know. So if you're a big multinational, you know, you have that power to talk to, you know, senior people in the Vietnamese government. But if you're a small company, then you've got to go through a lot of levels of approval. And I think that's a bigger difference too. And the other one, I know, Jacob, you may well comment on this, is warehousing space. It's with the shipping going one way from Asia to the USA, there's a bottleneck with getting goods manufactured into containers, into ships. So now you need to store your goods somewhere. And now warehouse space is at a premium now. And also warehouse space within 50 kilometers of any major center, port or population center, is at a huge premium at the moment. So this is happening as we speak.
Yeah, I would say that the warehousing issue is quite a big issue because a lot of companies here, they look at the cost of shipping, and they try to delay their shipping to Europe or the US or wherever. And because then they need to store it somewhere. The biggest issues that I've seen is really in the cold chain storage. They have, you know, Vietnam's a big exporter of fish and shrimp and stuff like this, and they're over capacity. There's no room, and then people are looking at the price and they say, well, we can't really make a profit if we export, if we pay so much for the logistics.
No, very good points there. I'm just going through the questions here, Andre. From David, international trade is more between trade agreements rather than open market forces. Is there a new world order? Well, first of all, there is a new world order in terms of the US administration deciding what agreements are in their interest and which ones are not. But on top of that, and I mentioned this the other day in this risk platform or risk conference I was at, I think the big challenge today is the border closures. Like, the physical closure of borders just makes everything so much more difficult, whether you have a trade agreement or not. And so if you happen to already have a factory in Vietnam and Mexico, then with the border closures, it's easier to get goods to market from Mexico, and then you don't have to worry about shipping all the way from Vietnam. You know, so in some ways, I would say that, I don't want to use that word, I hate the word decoupling. It's the efficiencies of the global supply chain are not as efficient now, partly because of, not necessarily because of broken agreements, but more so because of imbalances of trade. So you got ships going one way, and the ships to come back to the USA are empty. So that's because of a trade imbalance, right? And then that causes problems with the physical flow of goods, and then the warehousing, and what Jacob just mentioned, that then you got inventory pile up. So no matter how you have a free trade order and all the countries are happy with each other, and even if that was still in place, you're still going to have this imbalance of physically what is made in some parts of the world and physically what is demanded in other parts of the world. Next question is, let's have a look. See many Chinese factories in Vietnam that 2 years ago had one small production line. Now they have moved. This is from you, Jacob. Just reading out what you mentioned here. Most of their tooling and have gone to be able to 5% to now 50% more. Thank you. Yes. Next up, why is bureaucracy a challenge for electronic industry to move Vietnam? We just looked at that one.
We have one final one from David. There are 3 questions here.
I've got to scroll down. Would you like to read it out, Andre?
So the first one is, I think Jacob has also answered in some ways. Moving out from China to Vietnam, isn't it mainly political reasons? The USA factor, is this a smart move? Jacob has answered. He said, no, it's a smart move. And is there anything you'd like to elaborate further?
No, I think that people are overestimating the economic reasons. They're overemphasizing politically motivated numbers that are being published by China and believing them too much. So there's a lot of things. If you don't see what's happening on the ground and you don't see what's happening in different areas, you see a different situation. I lived in China for 14 years. The last, say, 6 years, 5-6 years I was in China. All I did was help companies leave China. That was what the big demand was. I helped them set up factories in Vietnam. I helped them set up factories in Thailand. I set up factories in the US, everywhere. So this is, the political thing made people that weren't aware of it. That was the difference. But the actual overall move and everything else, it didn't change anything.
Yeah, and right now it's hard to move now. Like, it's too late now for the most part.
Yeah, it's not too late, but it's very hard. I mean, I have companies constantly asking me how to help with setting up factories here and stuff. But when you can't bring in your people, you can't bring in your engineers, you can't set up your production lines with your engineers that actually know how to do it, and you're going to have to do it with other people that don't know really what they're doing. And instead of it taking 1 day, it's probably going to take a month.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and the costs are just greater all around.
Next, second question. In uncertainty environments, wouldn't economic reasons be more logical reasons than political reasons? Perhaps in some ways, Jacob has addressed so.
Sometimes, in uncertain environments, sometimes logic just goes out the window. So, but definitely economic. But look what Taiwanese did moving to Vietnam 5 years ago because of TPP. That was political.
Another one is China market is growing tremendously. So does it make economic sense to move out from China now?
It's a good question. No, it depends which product area that you're in. So H&M, like, they're between a rock and a hard place at the moment because they have a big market in China, but also a lot of their products were alleged to have sourced from Xinjiang cotton. And so in order to appease EU and US markets, H&M made an announcement that they are not sourcing Xinjiang cotton. Then suddenly they get doxxed in social media throughout China for saying something bad about Xinjiang cotton. And so now they're on the their brand is being blacklisted in China, not by the government, by consumers. And then H&M, they're in Vietnam, and the consumers find that on their website, they had a picture of the Southeast Asia with China having, political ownership over the Spratly Islands. And so in Vietnam, then they started doxing H&M because they, you're incorrectly displaying rights to these islands that they don't have rights to. So, you're done if you don't, if you don't. If for these big multinational brands, in some ways, they've got to walk a geopolitical tightrope. And if you are a smaller company, it's more likely you're walking the economic tightrope.
Okay, we have a question from a student. So COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerabilities of global supply chains built on lean manufacturing principles. How could firms be more prepared to mitigate and overcome these impacts?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because we all learned from Toyota decades ago that, okay, lean manufacturing, this is how you go. And so therefore in the automobile industry specifically, now they're realizing that that will not work for now. That now no longer works. This just in time is not going to be, we're not going to go back to just in time in the future. Just in time where different components would arrive at the automobile industry in the morning for the assembly in the afternoon. Like that, they're going to build in inventory buffers, and they're going to do something like what they did in the smartphone industry. They had a sort of semi just in time, like HTC worked with them in Taiwan. They had a warehouse at their factory where, doing 30 million smartphones a year back in 2012, they would have a mini warehouse next to their factory where they had 2 to 3 days of inventory of components. And so you'll find automobile companies, they cannot do that perfectly because the warehouse space needed to store 2 to 3 days of automobile components is going to be probably larger than the factory itself. So that's the big challenge. That's the ideal that they have to move to. And then they're going to have to put pressure on their supply chain to push warehousing space onto their suppliers. And so therefore, the only difference in the just-in-time is that the suppliers will have to guarantee to the automobile manufacturer that they have 2 to 3 days of components at the supplier's site. And the only difference is that on the day or the day before that those components are being trucked to the factory itself.
It's become a just in case to buffer against disruption.
Oh, totally. There was a beautiful Wall Street article on this. So this question is so timely. It's a really, really good question. Andre?
I have one last question. So is globalization dead, or what about regional agreements like TPP and Quad?
Is globalization as we know it dead? Much more regionalization, but you've got to, what is not dead is still the global consumer. And regional agreements are in some part are going to be even more political than what they have been in the past. So for example, at the moment, there are very strong ties between USA, Japan, and Australia in terms of their policy or their view of China. And that's getting Australia into hot water, making China saying, well, okay, we're not going to import as coal from Australia, we're going to get more dirty coal from other parts of Europe instead. These things are going to continue on. And yes, in globalization in the past is dead in that respect. But to that extent, but it's still going to follow the consumer. If you look in the 1970s and the 1980s, the footwear manufacturing was in Japan, then it went to South Korea, then it went to, Southeast Asia. But what has happened in the last 10 years is footwear manufacturing kind of diversified too. It just didn't just stay in one country only. So I would say that there's a lot more regional diversification that will happen now. The TPP, that will continue. That will come back in some way.
We've
Because
come to the end of the session. We have past the 1 p.m.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you very much, Prof. Neil, and thank you to everyone for taking the time to attend this session. Well, thank you to Jacob as well for giving us your insights from Vietnam and also from China.
Right.
I think we can everyone turn on your camera? Let's do a wave and then we just take a snapshot of everyone in the session today before we go.
Good to see you again, Jacob.
Okay.
Everyone, got a good turnout today. This is wonderful, 30.
Okay, let me take the screenshot. All right, thank you everyone. So that ends the session for today, and we hope to welcome you one more time in the near future.
Always happy to come back, Andre. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Jacob, for dropping in too. It's wonderful.